The morning begins the way mornings usually do in quiet places. There is no announcement that something important is about to happen. There is only the low, steady presence of routine, air moving through a room, distant traffic passing without notice, the familiar weight of another ordinary day settling into place. In Low Ranger, Louisiana, in 2024, nothing about the early hours marked them as different from any other. Silence in these moments is not alarming. It is expected. It belongs to neighborhoods before schedules take over, before voices rise and doors open, before the world demands attention. Time moves slowly, almost politely, giving the impression that there is space to correct, to pause, to intervene if something begins to drift off course. For a 4-year-old, the world is measured differently. It is measured in moments rather than hours, in the repetition of what feels safe and familiar. At that age, life is still small enough to fit inside routines created by others. Decisions are made elsewhere. Outcomes are shaped quietly, often far away, long before a child can understand their meaning. On this day, the ordinary continued, until it did not with a crash or a shout, but with an absence, a disruption that announced itself through what was missing, rather than what appeared. The kind of silence that does not belong to morning, the kind that lingers too long and refuses to explain itself. When systems are involved, their presence is often invisible at first. Paperwork exists somewhere else. Decisions are recorded in places the child will never see. Mental health evaluations, release processes, and law enforcement coordination move along established paths, designed to function without drawing attention to themselves. These mechanisms are meant to manage risk, to anticipate harm before it arrives, to act as barriers between vulnerability and irreversible loss, but sometimes those systems pass quietly through a moment without changing it. Sometimes they leave no sound behind. Sometimes the only indication they were ever there is what happens afterward. There is no single instant that declares a failure, no clear line where responsibility announces itself. Only the gradual realization that an ordinary morning has given way to something final, and that the chance to prevent it has already slipped into the past. In Low Ranger, Louisiana, in 2024, an ordinary quiet ended in permanent silence. His name was Nicole Brunett, and the child died. At 4 years old, a child is still learning what the world is made of, not in grand concepts, but in textures, tones, and repetition. The day is understood through patterns that repeat often enough to feel dependable. Morning follows night. Voices come back. Rooms stay where they are. For a child of that age, safety is not an abstract idea. It is something sensed, moment by moment, through consistency. Nicole Brunett was 4 years old. That number carries weight, not because of what had already been achieved, but because of what was still entirely open. At 4, personality is present but unfinished. Preferences begin to appear, then disappear, then return slightly changed. Curiosity exists without strategy. Emotion arrives quickly and leaves just as fast, making room for something new. Children at this age experience the world without distance. They do not separate themselves from what surrounds them. Sound is not background, it is the experience itself. Movement is not transit, it is exploration. A small space can feel endless. A short moment can feel complete. The future does not yet exist as a concept that requires planning or fear. A 4-year-old does not carry history the way adults do. Memory is lighter, less fixed. What matters most is what is happening now, and what usually happens next. Trust is not a decision, it is the default. When adults speak, children listen without weighing motives. When routines occur, they are accepted as truth. There is a particular kind of openness that belongs only to early childhood. It is visible in how attention shifts easily, how meaning is created from ordinary things. A pause can become a game, a sound can become a question. The world is full of invitations, and very few warnings. Even uncertainty is often met with curiosity rather than fear. At 4 years old, a child does not understand systems. There is no awareness of institutions, processes, or authority. There is no comprehension of decisions made in offices or documents signed elsewhere. The adult world operates beyond reach, shaping outcomes silently while the child remains focused on what is immediate and familiar. Potential, at this age, is not measurable. It does not appear as talent or achievement. It appears as possibility itself. Every child contains many possible futures, none of them chosen yet. Language is still forming. Identity is still flexible. The person this child might become exists only as a wide, unmarked space. What defines a child of 4 is not accomplishment, but presence, the ability to be fully engaged in a moment, to respond honestly to what is felt, to exist without pretense. There is no performance, no strategy, no attempt to manage how one is perceived. There is only reaction, curiosity, and need. A name at this age is not yet a legacy. It is a call spoken by others, attached to care and recognition. It means you, and here, and now. It anchors the child to the people and places that define their small world. Erin Nicole Brunett was 4 years old, in Low Ranger, Louisiana. In 2024, that age meant a life still entirely dependent on protection, judgment, and restraint exercised by others. It meant a person who could not assess risk, could not advocate, could not understand the forces acting around them. Childhood is often described as resilient, but resilience is not immunity. It does not replace responsibility. A child's adaptability exists alongside their vulnerability, not instead of it. The same openness that allows for wonder also allows for harm when safeguards fail. To humanize a child is not to imagine who they might have become. It is to recognize who they already were, someone present in the world, experiencing it fully, without defense, someone whose life was not abstract, not symbolic, not interchangeable. Erin Nicole Brunett was real. The child was 4 years old. Authority intervention often begins long before the public becomes aware of it. It does not announce itself with urgency. It arrives through established procedures, professional language, and decisions made within defined roles. In this case, responsibility moved through systems designed to manage risk, assess stability, and restore ordinary order. The mental health system was involved. At some point prior to the child's death, a psychiatric facility made a decision to release an individual. That decision occurred within a framework intended to balance safety, treatment capacity, and legal standards. Release in this context is not an absence of action. It is an action shaped by evaluation, criteria, and precedent. Such decisions are rarely singular or impulsive. They are typically based on available information at the time, observed behavior, clinical assessments, compliance with treatment, and thresholds defined by policy. The goal is not to predict the future with certainty, but to determine whether continued confinement is justified under the law and medical guidance. Within that framework, release can appear reasonable. Facilities are not designed for indefinite containment. Mental health systems operate under pressure to treat, stabilize, and discharge when legal and clinical benchmarks are met. The assumption is that other structures, families, communities, or external authorities will assume responsibility once a person leaves institutional care. Responsibility then transfers. It does not disappear. It moves from one authority to another, often without ceremony. Paperwork is completed. Jurisdiction changes. Oversight narrows or expands depending on the next point of contact. Each step follows rules that exist to prevent arbitrary decision-making. Law enforcement also became involved. Their role emerged not as an initiating force, but as part of a response that crossed state lines. Interstate law enforcement coordination is itself a procedural function, governed by agreements and protocols meant to ensure continuity when situations extend beyond local boundaries. From an institutional perspective, this coordination is a safeguard. It reflects an understanding that responsibility cannot remain isolated within a single agency when circumstances exceed its reach.
Communication between jurisdictions is meant to prevent gaps, not create them. At each stage, decisions were made within professional limits. Mental health authorities operated within clinical and legal boundaries. Law enforcement acted within jurisdictional responsibilities. Each system addressed the portion of the situation that fell within its mandate, relying on the assumption that other systems were doing the same. This is how authority often functions, in segments. No single agency holds the entire picture. Information is distributed. Responsibility is shared, but also divided. What appears comprehensive from within one institution may look incomplete when viewed as a whole. The logic behind these structures is practical. Specialization allows for expertise. Clear boundaries prevent overreach. Procedures are designed to ensure fairness, consistency, and accountability. In isolation, each step can be justified as appropriate, even necessary. From the inside, these decisions rarely feel reckless. They feel measured. They feel compliant. They feel aligned with policy. Risk is acknowledged but managed according to defined standards rather than hypothetical outcomes. The goal is to act reasonably, not omnisciently. Yet reasonableness within a system does not guarantee safety outside of it. Once responsibility passes from one authority to another, the margin for error expands. What is no longer monitored becomes assumed. What is no longer documented becomes invisible. In Low Ranger, Louisiana, in 2024, authority moved as it was designed to move. Responsibility transferred through the mental health system and into the realm of law enforcement coordination. Each decision followed an established path, shaped by institutional logic rather than individual intent. At no point did the process announce itself as a failure. It proceeded quietly, professionally, and without interruption, until the outcome revealed what the structure itself could not see. Warning signs are rarely clear when viewed in isolation. They emerge as ordinary elements within complex systems, often indistinguishable from routine variation. In cases involving multiple authorities, what later appears significant may initially register as administrative noise. The first indication often takes the form of timing. Decisions occur at moments that align with procedural schedules rather than lived circumstances. A release happens when criteria are met, not when uncertainty has been fully resolved. Within the mental health system, timing is governed by assessment intervals, bed availability, and legal thresholds. None of these factors on their own signal danger. They reflect normal operational constraints. Another sign can be found in the distribution of information. Data relevant to one authority may not be fully accessible to another. Mental health evaluations remain within clinical records. Law enforcement operates with reports, warrants, or alerts that serve a different purpose. When responsibility transfers, information may narrow, rather than expand. This is not necessarily an error. It is a consequence of privacy rules, jurisdictional boundaries, and role separation. At each point, the absence of certain details does not immediately appear consequential. Systems are designed to function with incomplete knowledge. Decisions are made based on what is available, not on what might exist elsewhere. The assumption is that critical information will surface if it is truly necessary. Geographic movement introduces another layer. When situations extend beyond a single location, coordination becomes procedural rather than continuous. Interstate law enforcement response relies on communication protocols that are effective but not instantaneous. Delays, handoffs, and waiting periods are built into the process. These intervals are expected and accounted for within policy. Individually, such delays are explainable. They are attributed to workload, verification requirements, or jurisdictional confirmation. Each pause has a rationale. None of them, standing alone, demands immediate concern. There is also the issue of role definition. Mental health systems assess mental state and legal eligibility for release. Law enforcement responds to violations, threats, or active situations. Neither system is structured to maintain prolonged oversight once their immediate criteria have been addressed. Responsibility shifts when a task is considered complete. This shift is often subtle. It occurs through documentation rather than conversation. A case is closed, transferred, or reclassified. Oversight does not end abruptly, it simply moves elsewhere. From within the system, this appears orderly. Another warning sign lies in normalization. When procedures function as intended, outcomes are assumed to be acceptable. Repetition reinforces confidence. A process that has worked many times before is trusted to work again. Deviations are noted only when they exceed established thresholds. In this context, concern is calibrated. Attention is directed toward anomalies, not toward scenarios that fall within expected ranges. If behavior, timing, or coordination does not violate policy, it does not trigger escalation. The involvement of multiple authorities can further diffuse perception. Each agency views the situation through its own operational lens. Risk is assessed relative to mandate. What one system considers resolved may still carry implications outside its scope. These implications remain unaddressed not because they are ignored, but because they are not clearly assigned. Communication between systems often relies on formal triggers. Reports, requests, or alerts must meet specific criteria to prompt action. Informal concern has limited weight. Without a defined mechanism to escalate uncertainty, ambiguity persists without resolution. Documentation itself can become a warning sign in retrospect. Records may show that steps were taken, boxes were checked, and protocols were followed. The presence of documentation creates assurance that responsibility was exercised. The absence of contradiction reinforces that assurance. From within the process, nothing appears urgent. Each action fits within precedent. Each decision aligns with policy. The cumulative effect is not visible while the process is unfolding. In cases involving children, this structural opacity becomes more pronounced. A 4-year-old does not generate reports, file complaints, or trigger procedural alarms. The child exists outside the systems making decisions that affect them. Their presence is indirect, represented only through association. This distance matters. When risk is assessed without direct engagement with the most vulnerable individual, warning signs rely entirely on interpretation. Interpretation, in turn, depends on available data, institutional priorities, and defined thresholds. None of these elements, individually, constitute a clear warning. Timing can be explained. Information gaps are expected. Jurisdictional delays are routine. Role boundaries are intentional. Normalization is efficient. Documentation is reassuring. Only later do these elements begin to align. Only in retrospect do they appear as a sequence rather than as isolated facts. The warning signs were not invisible, they were unremarkable. In Low Ranger, Louisiana, in 2024, the systems involved operated as designed. The mental health system released an individual under established criteria. Law enforcement engaged through interstate coordination when appropriate. Each action had a justification that made sense within its context. The warning signs did not announce themselves as warnings. They appeared as ordinary features of complex authority structures, features that required interpretation beyond any single role. Two perspectives existed at the same time, though they did not carry equal weight. One was formal, documented and reinforced by authority. The other was indirect, quiet, and largely unregistered. Both were present within the same sequence of events, yet only one consistently shaped decisions. On one side were institutions. The mental health system and law enforcement operated through defined roles, credentials, and procedures. Their assessments were recorded, their judgments standardized, their actions traceable through policy. Trust in these systems was not personal, it was structural. It rested on training, experience, and the assumption that established processes reduce error. These systems spoke a shared language, clinical terminology, jurisdictional codes, and procedural benchmarks allowed information to move efficiently between professionals. Even when responsibility transferred, authority remained continuous. Each institution recognized the legitimacy of the other's role, reinforcing confidence that the situation was being handled appropriately. Decisions made within this framework carried an inherent presumption of reasonableness. When a psychiatric facility released an individual, the release itself signaled that criteria had been met. When law enforcement engaged through interstate coordination, the involvement suggested oversight. Each action validated the next. Trust accumulated through continuity. On the other side was a child, 4 years old, without standing, without representation within the systems making decisions. Nicole Brunett did not appear in assessments as a decision-maker or evaluator. The child's position existed only in relation to others, indirectly acknowledged through circumstance rather than voice. This perspective did not generate documentation. It did not produce reports or trigger thresholds. It relied on others to recognize relevance, to assign importance, to act on behalf of someone who could not articulate risk or consequence. In institutional terms, this perspective was peripheral. What was trusted was expertise, professional judgment, compliance with policy, and adherence to protocol carried measurable value. These elements were visible, auditable, and familiar. They aligned with institutional accountability and legal defensibility. What was dismissed was not explicitly rejected. It was simply not foregrounded. The child's vulnerability did not present as a variable requiring independent evaluation. It existed as a background condition, assumed to be managed by the same systems addressing everything else. This imbalance was not created by malice. It emerged from structure. Systems are designed to respond to defined inputs. They prioritize what they are equipped to measure. When risk does not present in a form that fits existing categories, it competes poorly for attention. From the institutional perspective, the situation appeared contained. A release had occurred under appropriate standards. Law enforcement engagement followed established channels. No single authority was acting outside its mandate. Each step suggested control. From the child's perspective, there was no framework for interpretation. There was only dependence. At 4 years old, protection is not optional or conditional. It is total. The child does not exist alongside systems. The child exists beneath them. Trust flowed upward. Institutions trusted each other's assessments. Procedures trusted prior decisions. Authority trusted continuity. This trust reduced friction and allowed processes to move forward without interruption. Dismissal flowed downward, not as a conscious act, but as an outcome. The absence of a mechanism to elevate the child's specific vulnerability meant that it remained unexamined. What was not formally presented could not be formally weighed. The imbalance was reinforced by distance. Decisions were made away from the child's immediate presence. Evaluations occurred in controlled environments, separate from where the child lived. Law enforcement coordination spanned jurisdictions, further abstracting the context. In this abstraction, the child became an implication rather than a subject. Implications do not demand attention. They are acknowledged only insofar as they intersect with primary concerns. Here, primary concerns were compliance, jurisdiction, and procedural completion. The dual perspectives did not collide. They passed alongside each other without recognition. Authority advanced with confidence. Vulnerability remained static, unaddressed, and unseen by design rather than neglect. What the systems trusted was continuity. What they dismissed was the need for interruption. In Low Ranger, Louisiana,
In 2024, these two perspectives coexisted without resolution. One was empowered to decide, the other depended entirely on those decisions. The imbalance did not announce itself. It revealed itself only through outcome. The event did not begin with a single defining moment. It unfolded through a sequence of time markers that, taken individually, appeared ordinary. Each moment followed the last without signaling that it carried irreversible consequence. Earlier in the day, life.
Systemic failure does not require wrongdoing. It occurs when structures designed to protect instead permit harm by omission, fragmentation, or misalignment. In this case, prevention did not depend on extraordinary intervention. It depended on ordinary safeguards functioning together rather than separately. Prevention begins with continuity. When responsibility transfers between authorities, continuity must travel with it. The mental health system's decision to release an individual marked the end of one phase of oversight, but it did not eliminate ongoing risk. A preventable failure emerges when the end of one mandate is treated as the end of responsibility itself. One point of prevention lies in shared accountability. Mental health systems and law enforcement operate under different authorities, but they intersect in real-world outcomes. When those intersections are treated as handoffs rather than shared zones, gaps become inevitable. Prevention requires formal mechanisms that do not merely pass responsibility forward, but hold it jointly until risk is clearly reduced. Another preventable factor is information integration. Systems rely on partial data by design. Privacy rules, jurisdictional limits, and role specialization constrain what each authority can access. Prevention does not require eliminating these constraints. It requires compensating for them. Structured information sharing protocols that elevate child vulnerability as a priority variable could have altered decision-making without violating policy. Timing also matters. Decisions made according to schedule rather than circumstance introduce preventable risk. Psychiatric facility release is often governed by legal and clinical benchmarks, but those benchmarks do not account for downstream exposure unless explicitly required to do so. Prevention would involve temporal buffers, mandatory reassessment windows, or coordinated follow-up when children are implicated by proximity rather than participation. Oversight mechanisms represent another point of prevention. Once an individual exits institutional care, oversight often becomes reactive rather than proactive. Law enforcement response typically activates when criteria are met, not when risk is merely elevated. A preventive system would recognize that absence of a trigger does not equal absence of danger, particularly where children are involved. Interstate coordination further illustrates systemic vulnerability. Cross-jurisdictional response introduces delay by necessity. Prevention does not demand speed beyond feasibility. It demands redundancy. When time-sensitive situations cross borders, overlapping authority, not sequential authority, reduces exposure. Shared command structures or temporary joint oversight could have narrowed the window where no single system was fully responsible. Another preventable element is prioritization. Systems prioritize what they are designed to see. In this case, compliance, jurisdiction, and procedural completion were visible and measurable. Child safety, while fundamental, was not independently foregrounded within each authority's mandate. Prevention requires explicit prioritization embedded in policy, not assumed through good intent. Training also plays a role. Professionals operate according to what they are taught to recognize as relevant. When risk to children is indirect, it can be deprioritized without conscious dismissal. Prevention involves training that emphasizes indirect exposure as a critical factor, warranting escalation even when formal criteria are technically satisfied. Documentation practices can either conceal or reveal risk. Records in this case demonstrated compliance but not convergence. Each authority documented its own actions without synthesizing their collective effect. Preventive systems require documentation that does more than record steps. It must flag cumulative risk across agencies. Importantly, prevention does not require hindsight. The mechanisms described, continuity, shared accountability, integrated information, temporal buffers, proactive oversight, are not novel. They exist in other contexts precisely because fragmentation has been shown to produce harm. Their absence here reflects structural choice rather than impossibility. Responsibility therefore extends beyond any single decision. It rests with the design of systems that allow risk to move uncontained between mandates. It rests with policies that define completion without considering consequence. It rests with governance structures that reward compliance but do not require coordination. Shifting responsibility outward does not absolve individuals. It recognizes that individuals act within constraints imposed by institutions. When institutions do not equip individuals to see beyond their immediate scope, preventable harm becomes likely, even when everyone acts in good faith.
In Low Ranger, Louisiana, in 2024, prevention was not an abstract concept. It was a series of missed structural opportunities to slow down, overlap, communicate, and prioritize a child who could not protect themselves. The failure was not that systems existed, it was that they operated beside each other rather than together. Erin Nicole Brunett was 4 years old. The death was preventable not because someone failed to act, but because the system failed to require action where it mattered most.